Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. So much of our contemporary exploration of history is grounded in the stories of kings, queens, princes and princesses, and this does make sense. I mean, after all, these are the figures whose lives are, for the most part, the best recorded, and certainly we do talk about figures like this pretty frequently on this channel. However, we do also recognise the value and, frankly, the joy of exploring the lives of those who were not born to rule. And today, that is what we are going to be doing. We're going to take a look at a man who befriended, and as we will see, frequently bedded, some of Georgian Britain's leading players. For those he didn't manage to make friends with or seduce, he was more than happy to publicly mock, sometimes in verse. And so, let's take a look at the life of John Hervey. John Hervey was born in London on the 15th of October 1696. He was the eldest son of his father's second marriage. His father, who was also called John, had first been married to Isabella Carr, and by her he did have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Sadly, Isabella died while giving birth to her second daughter in 1693. Just over 2 years after this, in 1695, the elder John remarried, his new bride being one Elizabeth Felton, and the younger John, our John, was born the following year. John's parents would have 17 children in total. His early education was put into the hands of private tutors, but he did have free time, and apparently this was dedicated to, among other things, dicing, card play and horse racing. He then spent time at Westminster School before heading off to Clare College, Cambridge. Richter Norton suggests that, quote, Hervey's career very probably resembled that of the typical scholar he would later satirise. He went vigorously through a course of academical learning, drank with his tutors, lay with his laundress, broke the chapel windows, and then took a degree of Master of Arts. Certainly, John would graduate with his MA in 1715. A year before this, in 1714, Britain's final Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, had died. The House of Hanover was now at the helm, headed up by King George I. The new graduate's father, who was a politician and member of the House of Lords, had been staunch in his support of the Hanoverian succession, and so, when George became the king, the elder John Hervey was rewarded by being created Earl of Bristol. And if nothing else, this elevation is most helpful for our purposes, as it now allows us to avoid the confusion of talking about 2 John Herveys. From this point onwards, the father is going to be referred to as Lord Bristol. Following John's graduation, Lord Bristol was keen to prepare his son for a life of royal courtly favour too. John's elder half-brother, who was Lord Bristol's son from his first marriage, had already trod a path as had been set down by his father, and he'd done so to great success, so a plan was already in motion. Carr Hervey, known by the courtesy title Lord Hervey after his father became Earl of Bristol, had, like his younger brother would, already graduated MA from Clare College, Cambridge. He did so in 1710. Carr then set off for travels in Europe, during which time he was introduced to the Elector of Hanover, who would later become King George I. Upon his return from the continent, Carr was elected as the MP for Bury St Edmunds. This seat had been previously occupied by his father. Carr also became a Gentleman of the Bedchamber to the Prince of Wales, who would later become King George II. So, all of these best-laid plans, seemingly, were working out quite well, and thus it was decided that John would follow on a similar path, and so, after his graduation from Clare College, Cambridge, just 5 years after his brother, John also went on his travels through Europe. He made stops in Paris and Hanover. Specifically, he stopped at Herrenhausen, there to be presented to King George I, who was on holiday at that palace at that time. During this time in Hanover, John was also introduced to King George I's grandson, Prince Frederick. Frederick had been left behind by all of his immediate family so that he could hold down the proverbial Hanoverian fort, while his parents and grandparents set up their courts and spent most of their time seemingly rowing with each other in Britain. When John was 23, he made what I think seems to have been a love or maybe lust marriage, when on the 21st of April 1720 he married one of the maids of honour to Caroline of Ansbach, who at that time was the Princess of Wales. Although Mary Lepelle may have had this respectable place at the court of the future Queen, she was the daughter of an army officer, and so this match technically does not make much financial sense for the son of an earl. Hence my assumption that something other than the usual concerns of the marriage market are what actually motivated this match. Mary was reportedly very beautiful and very witty. This couple certainly had wit enough to conceal their marriage from all but those that were closest to them, which allowed Mary to continue to be paid for her role as a maid of honour. They would finally announce their marriage 6 months after it had actually taken place. John and Mary would have 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters. John was, inveterately, often fairly indiscreetly, unfaithful to his wife, about which a little more in a moment, because regardless, it does seem that this relationship was unaffected by John's behaviour. John's half-brother Carr died on the 14th of November 1723. He had never married, and thus John became heir to his father's earldom. So now he could use the courtesy title Lord Hervey. In 1725, he followed Carr in being elected as the MP for Bury St Edmunds, and at once he threw his fulsome support behind Sir Robert Walpole. When John entered politics, Walpole was the smart horse to back, as he enjoyed the favour of King George I. He was, though, less popular with the Prince of Wales. Nevertheless, John would remain loyal to Walpole following the death of King George I on the 11th of June 1727, even though it was widely assumed, even by Walpole himself apparently, that the accession of King George II would effectively destroy Walpole's career, and the careers of any who remained attached to him. As it turned out, though, John's loyalty would not, in fact, result in the destruction of his own fortunes, because Walpole maintained his influence. Indeed, his influence actually increased. Today, Walpole is remembered as being Britain's first Prime Minister. Now, in light of this, you might be expecting that John's going to stick around, to be close to Walpole, to keep reminding him that he is the one who had believed in him, had this enduring faith in him, effectively, that he is the one who should be rewarded for his loyalty. Instead, though, John chose to leave the country, to go off travelling around the continent for about 15 months, and he did so with his lover, Stephen Fox. During this period, John's wife, Lady Hervey, wrote letters to her husband speaking of her loneliness. Clearly, Lord and Lady Hervey must have been pleased to have been reunited at the end of his trip, because this couple's 5th child, Frederick Augustus, would be born almost exactly 40 weeks after his father returned. The reunion of husband and wife did not, however, signal the end of John and Stephen's affair, which would continue on for more than a decade. Lady Hervey and Stephen Fox were not at odds, quite the opposite. All the evidence points to the fact that this pair enjoyed an enduring friendship. After returning from his travels with Stephen, John was also able to pick up where he left off career-wise too, and so he began climbing the ladder. In 1730, he was made Vice-Chamberlain to King George II's household, a role that allowed him a seat on the Privy Council. It was also a role that placed him in the company of the royals. John got on so well with the new Queen, Caroline of Ansbach, about whom I have made a video that I will leave linked, that this pair became almost inseparable. Indeed, there are rumours that they had an affair. One thing that John and Caroline of Ansbach did not agree on, at least at first, was the then Prince of Wales, Frederick. Frederick loathed his parents, and the feeling was seemingly mutual. John, however, was friends with the prince and had been for a number of years. Some suggest that John and Frederick were lovers. Now, if you're keeping track, when it comes to John's relationships, a theme is beginning to emerge. By the early 1730s, John and Frederick's relationship, whatever form it had really taken, had begun to break down. John's friendship with Caroline grated on Frederick. Then, John and Frederick both began affairs with one of Caroline's maids of honour, called Anne Vane. Anne became pregnant, and she named Frederick as the father of her baby. Queen Caroline dismissed her. Frederick provided her with accommodation, and would continue to visit her and her son, who was born on the 5th of June 1732, and was named Cornwall Fitz-Frederick to further assert his place as Frederick's true child. John, however, claimed that the child was really his. He also claimed that Anne was once again receiving his advances from 1734, while she was being funded and visited by the prince. John and Frederick fell out to such a degree that by the middle of the 1730s, John and Queen Caroline could bond over their shared hatred of Prince Frederick. This was not the only tense interpersonal relationship that John was a part of, because he was also the focus of someone else's abject hatred during this period, a hatred that found its release in a war of words. Alexander Pope hated John Hervey. In one example, from a poem from 1735, Pope conflated John with Sporus, the boy that the Emperor Nero castrated and married. Quote, "Let Sporus tremble. What? That thing of silk? Sporus, that mere white curd of ass's milk? Satire or sense, alas, can Sporus feel? His wit all seesaw between that and this, now high, now low, now master, up, now miss, and he himself one vile antithesis, amphibious thing, that acting either part, the trifling head or the corrupted heart, fop at the toilet, flatterer at the board, now trips a lady, and now struts a lord." Now, Pope had been a rival for the affections of Mary Lepelle, whom, as we know, John would successfully woo and wed. However, all that wooing and wedding had occurred some years previously. This attack, some years later, was therefore likely motivated, we think, by John's own vicious pen. One of the people that John had met while he was travelling after university was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. I have got a video on her that I will leave linked, but suffice to say, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was clever, creative, and just achingly cool. People wanted to be her friend. John wanted to be her friend, and so did Pope. As it turns out, Pope wanted to be more than friends, and Lady Mary was not keen. She may, though, have been more willing to entertain John's advances in this regard. I'm sure you will not be surprised to learn that it's rumoured that Lady Mary and John may have been lovers. Nevertheless, there was a friendly literary exchange between Pope and Lady Mary, at least for a time. That exchange would cool. And perhaps along the way, feelings got hurt. And maybe that explains why Pope chose to snipe at Lady Mary in his Dunciad, and also why he then refused to cave to private requests to remove or alter the offending lines. And so, in 1733, Lady Mary responded with verses addressed to the imitator of Horace. This work might have been co-authored by John, and certainly he would associate himself with it. In this text, Pope is ridiculed as nothing more than a spiteful, low-born writer. He is also mocked for a pronounced physical difference that he had, namely, a hunched back. The poem ends with the following assertion, quote, "But as thou hatest, be hated by mankind, and with the emblem of thy crooked mind marked on thy back, like Cain, by God's own hand, wander, like him, accursed through the land." Alexander Pope's sporous response had the effect of silencing John from creating or being involved with creating further poetic barbs. But this silence from John did not stop Pope's ongoing attack on his character, politics, morality, and sexuality. Now, at this time, adultery, whether alleged or otherwise, could result in some fairly unpleasant consequences for the individual accused or guilty of the same. They would likely be ostracised by their community, certainly by their church community. John is also having sexual relationships with other men, and this fact could result in the harshest punishments of the time. Most people, I think, would have felt the need to hide this part of their lives for fear that they would be on the receiving end of such treatment. But John seems to have felt no such impetus to hide any of the affairs he was having, and nor did those around him seem to feel any need to publicly censure him. Then, as now in many ways, wealth, power and the right connections do serve as a proverbial get-out-of-jail-free card, and so, for the most part, John seems to have been free to live as he pleased. It looks like those around him were actually amused by his affairs. They liked his effeminate behaviour and dress. John had been an early adopter of the Parisian fashion for wearing white makeup, and so it seems to me that John Hervey's differences were accepted, indeed celebrated in some cases, by those that he surrounded himself with, many of whom were members of the royal court, indeed members of the royal family. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu reportedly divided the human race into, quote, men, women and Herveys. In 1737, John's dear friend Queen Caroline needed urgent treatment for an abdominal issue, which was likely a hernia. It seems that her treatment was very badly botched, so much so that after more than a week in agony, the Queen died. John had spent time with her during those last painful days, and he was utterly bereft at her loss. Evidence of just how striking this loss was to him can be found, I think, in his decision to end his Memoirs of the Reign of King George II at the point of her death. The reign of George II did have many years left to run after this point. In fact, this reign would continue beyond John's own death. These memoirs would remain unpublished during John's lifetime because some of their content was fairly shocking. A fairly heavily redacted version, one that was kinder to the royal family, would only be published in 1848. Then, an enlarged but still not complete version of the text was printed in 1931. As for what might be missing from this later edition, well, scholars do query if the still lost section made explicit reference to there being a sexual relationship between John and Frederick, Prince of Wales. Without Queen Caroline to fill his time, and from Walpole's point of view, his valuable efforts, John was now considered for further promotion. Unfortunately, witty John Hervey might have been a little too acerbic for some, because apparently his open mockery of the Duke of Newcastle earned him another enemy, an enemy who had both the power and the desire to attempt to block any political advancement that John was suggested for. By 1740, though, John's enduring support and defence of Walpole and his policies would no longer be overlooked. Newcastle's opposition to his rise would now be overridden, and so John became Lord Privy Seal. This made him one of the great officers of state, with a seat available in the Cabinet Council. John's support for Walpole did not simply manifest as voting with him or speaking up in his favour. John also dedicated his time to the writing of effective polemical works in favour of Walpole's policies and of Whiggery in general. However, just 2 years later, in 1742, with Walpole's foreign policy causing consternation, the Prime Minister's hold on power finally slipped. He resigned. John hung on as Lord Privy Seal for just a few more months, and then he too resigned. He did attempt to rally support for a move against the new regime, but this proved unsuccessful, and it also caused the breakdown in John's relationship with Stephen Fox, because their intimate relationship had continued on up until this point. John's health soon worsened. He had struggled with many periods of fairly serious illness from his youth. He was reportedly fairly fragile in this regard. But this period of ill health of unknown origin would prove to be his last. John Hervey died on the 5th of August 1743. He was 46 years old. John's biographer, Reed Browning, explains that, quote, Hervey drew up a will in the last month of his life. Although conventional with respect to his children, with his eldest son being designated sole heir and the other children receiving annuities, it was astonishingly savage in its treatment of Lady Hervey. She received only the minimum required by their marriage contract, a jointure of £300 per year, and was further humiliated by stipulations, suggesting that she might, if given freedom to dispose of property, seek to deprive their children of an inheritance. The grounds for such pettiness provoked much speculation in the succeeding months, and no generally accepted explanation for Hervey's vindictive treatment of his wife has appeared. Perhaps there is evidence of a measure of disorientation in his final year. He succumbed to loss of wit before loss of life. The size of his estate is unknown, but since it was not divided upon his death and since his heirs prospered, observers concluded that it had been unencumbered. So what do you think of John Hervey, of his life and legacy? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. But I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, which in turn will get the video shared out more by YouTube, which will hopefully help us to grow our community. As an emoji, what shall we pick? I think something that either screams courtier, or maybe whatever emoji you think of when you think of John Hervey, let's put that there. I do look forward to seeing whatever you're going to pick. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. If you like my channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me about this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, have a check just to make sure you've not been unsubscribed against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claim they will tell you when I've next uploaded and also when I'm next going live, which I do to talk about the history news that happens once a month. We go through the history news headlines that have been in the press. You are not going to want to miss that. Of course, we have now got our failsafe. Head over to my website. It will be linked. It is www.katrinamarchant.com. Please head to the contact page, and when you get there, you will find this box. Put your email address in that box and hit sign up. This will add you to my list, which will let me send you out an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to, and also to send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're all going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.